Muy buenas tardes.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for being with us this afternoon. I'm a professor from the Complutense University, delighted to bid you a cordial welcome this afternoon. As you know, the Foundation for years now has collaborated very fruitfully with the Asociación Española de Economía and with Cosme. And the section, as you know, especially focuses on an academic analysis of gender issues. So this is, of course, an area that we're very interested in, gender-related issues, and we tackle it from an academic, scientific, and research point of view. As a result of this cooperation, I'm delighted to share with you the conference. We have with us Claudia Olivetti from Dartmouth College, and she will be addressing the issue families, working market, and familiar or family politics. Buenas tardes, profesora Olivetti. Voy a hablar en castellano porque es nuestra política de la casa y solo digo cosas bonitas acerca de usted. Now I'm going to give the floor to Lidia Farré, President of Cosme, who will introduce our speaker and who will, after the address, have a conversation with her. Lidia Farré is a professor at the University of Barcelona, a researcher, and has a PhD in economics, the Instituto Universitario of Florence, and her research focuses on analysis of the market and specifically in understanding the factors that would explain the pay gap. So the best possible hands. I leave you in the best possible hands. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Miguel, very much. Good afternoon. I'm happy to welcome all of you. We're going to be hearing talk about families, the labor market, and family policies. We're very lucky because we have with us Professor Claudia Olivetti. Let me begin by saying thank you. Thank you all for being with us this afternoon. There is no doubt that without you and your interest, if you weren't here, well, this session would simply not take place. And secondly, let me say thank you to the Ramón Areces Foundation. Thank you for your ongoing support to Cosme. Today's activity is an activity that we have organized jointly, the Foundation and Cosme. Cosme is the Committee on the Situation of Women in the Economy, the Spanish acronym, the Spanish Association of Economy, which is entrusted with assessing and promoting the status of women within the profession of economics. Among the activities carried out by Cosme, I would like to underscore the workshop, which was organized in the past and which continues to be organized every year in May at the Foundation, and which is possible, of course, thanks to the kind and generous support of the Areces Foundation. During this session, we address research in gender economy, and we, of course, are lucky because we have with us leading experts the world over. So once again, on behalf of Cosme, on behalf of the Spanish Association of Economics, thank you. Thank you to the Foundation for your commitment, for your kind support to this field of research. And, of course, now I have to say thank you very much indeed to Professor Claudia Olivetti. Thank you, Professor, for having agreed to spend time with us today. Professor Olivetti comes from the United States of America, and she has been so generous with us because not only has she agreed to participate in today's event, but on Saturday she was keynote speaker for Cosme within the symposium which was organized in the city of Valencia. So, Professor Olivetti, thank you so very much for your time and generosity of spirit. Professor Claudia Olivetti is George Record's professor, a full professor of economics at Dartmouth College, and she is also a researcher at NBR, the National Bureau of Economic Research, and she is co-director of the Gender in the Economy Study Group, again from this same institution. She has been a professor at Boston University as well. Claudia Olivetti is a well-known researcher in the field of the economy of labor and in the economy of family. She is a renowned contributor to the most distinguished publications. A long list of publications is being read out, among others. And of course, her contributions are very influential. She has studied, for instance, issues and areas which are as important as the imprint of social norms on the persistence of the pay gap and the effect of public policies on the evolution of gender inequalities. Today, Professor Olivetti is going to explain to us the more relevant aspects that address the evolution of gender inequality over the past few decades. And furthermore, she will be talking about the contribution of public policies to the convergence of opportunities in the labor market involving men and women. So thank you very much, Professor Olivetti. Again, thank you very much to the Foundation, and thank you very much, Professor Olivetti, for being with us this afternoon. I'm very happy to give you the floor.
First of all, I want to thank the Foundation and Cosme for having me here, and Lidia for the great introduction, and kind of all the people at Cosme who have been incredible also over the past few days. I've been really enjoying this trip. Okay, so it's not, this will not come as a surprise, but in the second half of since the second half of the 20th century, women have made major progress in the economy and in society across most countries in the developed world. Among the main trends over this period have been the narrowing. So over time, women's college graduation first catch up to men's and then surpass them. And we have witnessed what Claudia Goldin, which is a famous economist working on women, called grand convergence. We have seen women's employment behavior and earnings converging to those of men. Okay? In part, this process has been due to the fact that women increasingly have been obtaining degrees, including professional degrees, and entering occupations where against this backdrop, we have also observed delayed in family formation and also in marriage, in part aided by technological progress, like the birth control pill that allowed women to actually control the timing of their fertility and therefore allow them an horizon of time over which they could invest in their own education and their own human capital by entering professions where large investments in time are required to have a career. Okay, many factors in the literature on these topics is huge, and many factors have been emphasized as contributing to these trends. Okay, so I just mentioned the contraceptive pill. Other more gender-neutral development have been the development of the service sector in the economy that has both pushed and pulled women into the labor market, and also cultural change that has been mostly working through over time through changes in the time horizon of women's decision, as well as really strong changes with the political movement of the late 60s, for example, in women's identity. So over this period, women's identity has changed, has become more like men, and we observe women increasingly wanting to combine career and family, okay? But despite this pink, kind of very happy picture that I've just painted of gender convergence, persistences in gender gaps in both employment and earnings are still there, okay? And in particular, they seem to widen over the course of women's life cycle, and to be particularly pronounced for a set of women, like women with a college degree, or even women with low degrees or obtaining an MBA, for example, okay? For this group, we do see not only that, when they go out, when they graduate, their opportunities are very similar to those of men. However, over the course of their life, the picture changes greatly, and the gender earnings gap actually widened substantially. So what is the role of policies in all of this, in this development, okay? On the one hand, the fact that women increasingly attended college degree, went to professional school, and made this important investment has implied that women's demand, okay, for policies, for family policies, has, in some countries at least, like in Scandinavia, driven policies, okay? So in some countries, women have been demanding more and more government intervention to help her reconcile career and family. On the other hand, some policies, but as we'll see later, but not others, as well-intentioned as they could be, have eased actually women's entering the labor market and perhaps in some cases staying in the labor market, which is even more important, okay? However, this progress towards an increasing generosity in family policies has not been there's not unanimous support for it. And in the discourse that has been either advocating or opposing the extension of the government role in issues that have to do with parental leave as well as childcare, have been, we have seen two different views, okay, prevailing. On the one hand, social justice argument, mostly from the part of the proponents of these policies, have emphasized the importance of these policies for reducing gender inequalities, okay? But another part of the story that has been perhaps less less popular, let's say, in the public discourse have been efficiency arguments, okay? The idea is that it's not only, some proponents would say, oh, family policies, you choose to have children, so why should taxpayer pay for policies that only affect women? On the other hand, we can well say that as more and more women acquire very high level of education, there is an efficiency argument to this. I mean, how can we have this enormous amount of talent? Government and society cannot afford, to some extent, to lose 50% of their college graduates once they have children and they're not working in the labor market. So this both type of argument are actually important when we think about these policies. So what I will do today, I will start by trying to give you a big picture of this process of convergence that I just described. And the picture will be comparative, okay? So I will give you trends among 24 countries that have been organized in two groups, roughly corresponding to the conservativeness from least to most of their gender roles, okay? But of course, within this grouping, there is a lot of variation, and you will see it in action later on when I show you the trends, okay? And then I will discuss the topics of family policies from the pure standpoint of economic theory, okay? Essentially, what would an economic model where husband and wife are choosing who's doing most of the home production and who's doing more hours on the market, what would be their efficient choice? And how is this choice of allocation of time across the spouses, how is this affected by policies and by norms, okay? And related to this intuition from economic theory, I will kind of summarize an incredible amount of literature in the field of economics that's been testing, and in the first row we have many people who have actually made very important points on the evaluation of these policies, for example. I will try to give you really an overview, just what are, if we read this enormous body of work, what are the main lessons that we can learn from policies that have been implemented in many, many different countries over time, okay? And then I'll conclude by highlighting some areas of for the discussion of research and for the discussion on family policies that I think have been less explored. All right. So this first picture is a little difficult to see, so I will guide you through it, and I will probably need, can I walk through to the screen, or, yeah? Okay, so what this graph is trying to convey to you is, in a sense, is women's road to both, first to equality in terms of college graduation rate, and then, even obtaining more than an equal kind of education with men, actually. So on the horizontal axis, what we have is, so for a country, we look at women that in a decade, say the 1970s, are 35 to 44-year-old, and we compute what is the share of this group that has a college degree. And one thing that is important here, that by college degree, I really mean the equivalent of a 4-year college degree in the US. Therefore, this is important because, for example, it's not necessarily 4 years. So with the 3+2 reform that Europe has implemented not so long ago, a 3-year college degree will be considered at the same level as the US for college degrees. So these kind of graduates are included, okay? On the vertical axis, we have the same statistics, but for men, okay? So starting from here, so if I look at the red triangle, which is the USA, the first data point that we have is in the 60s, okay? So in the 60s, in the US, college graduation rate weren't that high, okay? Both for men and for women, okay? So they were about 5% for women and a little over 10% for men, okay? And corresponding to this, in each graph, you see, maybe you don't, but there is a very faint gray line. That is the 45-degree line that represents equality, okay? When a country, so what we see here, that over time, and what I want you to take from this graph, is that over time, and across all those countries in this first group at least, we move from, college graduation rate has been increasing for both men and women, but have been increasing disproportionately for women, so that by year 2000, most of these countries are crossing that 45-degree line. In other words, in most of these countries, in this first group of Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian economies, women have higher college graduation rate than men, okay? A similar pattern emerges actually across economy. What you just see, so in this last panel, Spain is the gold line with the empty square. So as you will see, the pattern is very similar for Spain. In the 1980, it starts over here, so above the 45-degree line, with men having more college than women. But by already, actually, by the year 2000, Spain also crosses the line. And in fact, if you look at the statistics for Spain in the 2010s, so from 2010 to 2019, women, and you see how far away it is from the line, it means that in Spain, women are really disproportionately more likely to go to graduate college, not attend, actually finish it, than men, okay? So we could say that, okay, based on this picture, we see that women are making a lot of progress, okay? However, what also matters in terms of future earnings is the field of study, okay? And what we see is that very there is a persistent difference over time in the type of fields that men and women go into, the type of major they do. And just to illustrate that, I'm going to just show you a graph for the US, but this is pretty similar across the world. So what this graph is showing you is telling you that of all the graduates, college graduates in a given year, okay, that major in a certain field, say engineering in the 1980s, what is the fraction of those who were female? And you see that engineering in 1980 was about 10%. Only 10% of all the people graduating college in the US with a major in engineering were women. And as you see, both engineering and computer sciences actually have gone up, but not that much. And this is against a backdrop of large increase in women's college attendance, okay? Economics is pooled with other social sciences, so it's that blue line. So in economics here, but I think it's because it's pooled with other topics, about 50% of those are women. And then you see that health profession, the usual suspect, education, public administration, these are the fields that disproportionately have been and continue to be female, okay? So again, I'm painting a very nice picture, but against this backdrop of convergence, persistence still are there that matters for earnings later on, okay? So what are the other trends? As women have been acquiring more education, they've been obviously postponing marriage, okay, and also fertility. And so in this graph, as you can see, across all countries and pretty much to the same degree, the graph describes each point. It means is the share of women aged 35 to 44 in a given decade who eventually, by age 35 to 44, married, okay? So even with the postponement in age of marriage, every married rate, the share of of women who eventually get married declines, but doesn't decline too much, okay? And here I want to point out that by marriage, I mean both marriages and legal unions as defined, or the jure unions as defined in each of these countries, okay? What is interesting is that, to some extent, we know that cohabitation has become increasingly popular in most countries. And so we see that basically cohabitation, though, and I will skip the graph, are, especially for college-educated women, are not necessarily an absorbing state. So as this development have realized, a lot of women, couples first start living together, then they have children, then eventually they enter a legal union or marriage. So so things have changed over time in terms of cohabitation, but it's mostly with the path, it's the path to marriage that has changed, not so much the share of people who are actually married, okay? So I'll skip the next graph. Again, the other phenomenon that has affected most women in most countries has been the decline in fertility. So once again, as women push out the age at first child, in part because of this investment, in part because perhaps they cannot establish an independent household because their earnings are not as large to allow them to do so. We see declining in fertility across all the countries. In the Anglo-Saxon countries, fertility already starts pretty low, around 2 children in the 70s, and declines to a little bit above around replacement rate over time. This set of countries somewhat in between, but what I want to highlight that in the last group of countries, which include, of course, Spain, as you see, Spain relative to this country, they start from about 2.5 child per capita per woman in the 80s, and then that declines substantially, okay? So and it's kind of in the middle, in the mid-pack. So, but what is interesting is that one thing that happened over time is that usually we think that women don't work. To some extent it's still true, okay, because of fertility. What happened over this period is that the relationship across country between fertility and employment changes, okay? So that by the end of the period, actually, tends to be the case that countries like Denmark, Sweden, and so forth, where more women participate, okay, also have higher fertility than countries like Spain or Italy, where fertility is actually lower, okay, than them. Okay, so why is that? You know, perhaps this has something to do with the policy that they have implemented over time to help women stay in the market. Finally, last but not least, these are the trends that I've been discussing in the beginning. Over this period, we have seen gender gap in employment declining substantially. And here, once again, you see the huge variation across country. So now what I'm plotting is the gender employment gap, is the difference between the employment rate of the labor force participation rate of men, of women, minus that of men. That is why it's negative, okay? So what you see is that in the Anglo-Saxon world and Scandinavia, gap has been closing, but they are around 30%, okay? 20 to 30% in the beginning, and they kind of all converge to a gap in employment of about 10 percentage points, sorry. That means that if the employment rate of men is 90%, the employment rate of women is 80%. So they're very similar, okay? The picture, again, the middle countries are just, to some extent for today, I'll use it as they're in between, okay? The picture is very different in these other countries. And here, remember that I'm including kind of participation, so unemployment might be playing a role here. But what we have, for instance, in Spain, we see this huge, actually, change in employment opportunity of men versus women. So in the 80s, there was a gap of 70%, of 70. And by the end of the period, the gap in Spain is no different from the gap. I mean, it's a little larger than the gap in these other countries. So there is improvement, okay, in employment, okay? So next, what happened to the gender earnings gap? So here I'm going to show you something that might surprise you, okay? And it's the following. The gender earnings gap, the gender pay gap, is actually higher in Scandinavia to some extent, or I mean similar, than in this last group of countries that includes Southern Europe, South America, Central America, and Taiwan, okay? This appears surprising at first. Can we conclude that Spain and Italy have achieved gender equality in pay to a larger extent than Sweden from this picture? The answer is no, and the key reason why the answer to this question is no has to do with the previous graph that I showed you, okay? What does the gender earning gap depend on, okay? In part, the size of the gap is going to depend to differences in inequality. So women tend to disproportionately appear towards the bottom of the earning distribution overall. In countries like the US, for example, or the UK, that have seen a huge increase in inequality, the gender earnings gap would tend to be larger just because of that, okay? Just because there is more inequality in the income distribution, that more inequality translates, basically, because of where women are, translating to larger gender earning gap, okay? So that increase in inequality can explain in part why countries like US have relatively larger earnings gap, okay? So what is the other factor that is important? The other factor that is important and that can explain the fact that in Southern Europe, for example, the gender earning gap has been more or less appears to be more or less constant over time, has to do with participation. So the idea is that when few women work, when the employment gap is very, very large, okay, what happens is that mostly women who are working tend to have higher wage characteristics, tend to perhaps be mostly teachers, okay, that have relatively good earnings, okay? So that when I'm comparing the average man who is working to the average woman who is working, okay, these are, the average man who works in very gender conservative countries where fewer women work tend to be pretty much the same as the average man in the population. But the average working woman at low level of participation tend to be very, very highly qualified. So much so that when I compare the wages on average of this set of women who is actually working, is very similar. It's closer to that of men than in other countries where we know maybe there are fewer. There is even to some extent less discrimination, less space for gender earnings to be different okay? And in fact, so in this gap, what I'm showing you is the gender pay gap, where I just calculate the average over those who actually have a wage, okay? So let's look at everybody who is employed, men and women, and compute the earnings, and then we take the difference and we get the gap, okay? But what if we compute earnings, the average earnings, in the overall population, okay? To the extent that a very low fraction of women work, say, I don't know, if we're in a country where only 40% of women work, and the other 60% have zero earnings, okay? Once I add that 60% with zero earning back and I compute the average, that results in very, very small average earnings for the women in that country relative to some other group. And in fact, that's what is true. So if you just focus for these other groups, once you include the zero, gender earnings gap don't change much, but for the last set of country, actually you get much larger earnings differential. And practically for Spain, this is the equivalent of the graph that I shown you before for the employment gap, because what is lowering, what is determining this huge wage gap initially is the fact that very, very few women work, and those who work are really, really good, okay, are disproportionately positively selected. Okay, so to summarize, so what do we see in the world in these 24 countries with some differences in terms of timings and levels, okay, over time? We see convergence in education, employment, and earnings. We see decline in fertility, and also we see a decline that I didn't really show you in legal partnerships, so cohabitation become more prevalent. And we see that according to most indicators, and perhaps I didn't emphasize it enough in my discussion, in the 1970s, the distance across countries, across this group of countries that I've just shown you, in terms of gender earnings gap, there's a lot of dispersion. Some countries are doing much better than others, okay? But over time, by 2010, even if gender convergence is really far from being complete, you have the countries seem all to be more or less converging to the same point. And the same point, for example, in terms of a gender pay gap, conditional working, is that stubborn 20% differential, meaning that women make quite a bit less than men on average, okay? The literature that is really vast on this and really, really well done has shown that over time, what matters, what can explain this persistence, even as we see this amazing convergence in women's employment, human capital, and so forth, why in none of those countries we see the gender earning gap going to zero? And why do we still observe pretty substantial, although not huge, employment gender earnings gap in the 2010s, okay? So the literature has shown that the most, over time, what really, really explain the persistence of the gap is the presence of children, okay? So to the extent that there are kind of gender roles prescribed, that the main caregiver in the family is the woman, okay? Then what we see is that women are very, very much penalized, especially as their levels of education is increasing, okay? Because women with more education and women with professional degree disproportionately are entering careers, I don't know, as lawyers or working in finance, where promotion pretty much depend on hours work and on staying there. And professions where even a small break may result in missed opportunity that are very, very large, okay? So one thing that we see in the data is that, in fact, while for women having a child results in this huge motherhood penalty, for men having a child is most often, and pretty much across all the countries that I've shown you, associated with a premium, not a gap, a premium. So fathers earn more than non-fathers in most of these countries, and especially so for exactly the college-educated men who are in exactly the same professions with very high return to making it that women have been entering disproportionately into, okay? So why is this important? Why is these are important consideration as we go into an analysis of family policies? Is that family policies, because of this underlying specialization in home production, face an uphill battle in the sense that some policies that seem very good on paper might backfire, might actually entrench gender differential in earnings instead of helping women. And I'll show you in the next time. Okay. So the theoretical consideration, so I told you at the beginning that something that is missing from the discussion, especially the policy discussion, is the efficiency argument, okay? So in economics, when we think about a household problem, right, how much home production does a wife do, how much time does she spend caring children, and how much time do men do, okay? We can think about that problem as a pure economic problem, where you have the household is like a production unit, okay? And what are we producing? Let's assume we're just producing childcare. And husbands and wife are trying to choose who does what based on, in a pure economic model, based on comparative advantage, okay? So by comparative advantage, we mean, okay, the following. We have this activity to perform, educating our children. How much time is going to be spent by each of the partner is going to be determined by how costly the time of that each of the partner is. Okay, how much are we losing if, how much earnings are we losing if one of the two partners is doing an extra hour of child work? Perhaps the partner with the lower earnings should be the one and that should do more home production. The problem is that because of a variety of reasons, most of the time, that parent with the lower earnings is a woman, historically, okay? So, but comparative advantage is not just it's determined by a bunch of things that includes, obviously, the wage that you get on the market, and that wage would be different for women, for example, because of discrimination, okay? But the comparative advantage is also determined by home productivity, where that home productivity or the fact that women are better supposedly at some activities, or they prefer they have a stronger preference for children's quality, for example, something that's found in the literature, is not necessarily innate, okay? So the way in which gender norms enter this equation is that gender norms that reflect stereotypes, okay, may really affect women's productivity later on if, for example, we teach girls how to cook, how to clean, and how to take care of children, but not boys early on, okay? So this is basically the model in which Historically, women have had that comparative advantage, but that comparative advantage doesn't necessarily mean that they have lower market productivity. They might have the same market productivity of the men, but they may be remunerated less, okay, for whatever reason, or they may have been taught better how to do certain activities. So it's a little bit more complex than that. In this type of model, the theory would tell us, if the model is a model in which households are taking, policies, wages, career path, promotion probability from the market exogenously, and based on that are choosing who's doing most of the house production, in that model, some policies are going to do really, really badly, okay? So for example, in countries, and this is not the case for Spain, so Spain is doing a good job on this, countries where there is joint taxation, that is, people are, once you're married, even if you file individually, you're going to be taxed on the basis of the total household income. In these type of countries, especially if there are very high marginal income taxes, individual taxation may lead to even more unequal outcome in employment if women are the secondary earner, okay? Because what happens is that once you marry, if you take two partners of pretty similar earnings, when they're not married, they're taxed individually, okay? Each of them is earning $100,000 or euros, and they're taxed according to those 100,000 euros. But once you combine them, they actually are earning 200,000 per year. So they jump tax bracket immediately if they're taxed on the joint income. Other policies that have been found, according to the model, childcare support instead, unlike the marginal taxation, seems to be, in some cases, beneficial, and especially if, in the model, the support that is given in terms of childcare completely substitutes for mother time, is in kind. I'm offering you a childcare services, okay. And then finally, parental leave, and this is, I think, important, is not necessarily good, in the sense that it is good, but up to a point, in the following sense. On the one hand, having right to getting your job back for mothers and fathers may encourage them to stay in the labor force, okay? If there are friction, you get your job back, so that is good. On the other hand, there might be dynamic costs to the extent that women, if they stay out too long, they're missing on promotion, and they're missing on assignment to particular tasks within an organization that would lead to higher wage growth in the future. So there is this trade-off. In this model, and then I'll talk about briefly about the literature, since in this model, right, it's a model in which we are trying to efficiently allocate husband and wife to the two activities, home and market, depending on for which of these two that's less costly. Because of this dynamic consideration, this model would tell you that the more, if you give a lot of leave to moms and zero to fathers, okay, you're making women even more different than men in the eyes of employers, and also in terms of whether they're there to get their promotion, okay. So in this kind of theory, giving leave to men and making them more similar to women, that can help reduce inequality, okay? So what we see in the data, actually, what we see when, as a summary of the work that people have done evaluating these policies, okay, for parental leave, what is interesting is the following. There is no evidence of really, really large effect overall, okay, with the following qualification. Across country, the evidence is, if we think in terms of just protected leave, so it's not paid, okay, more leave gives positive effect on women's employment up to about 50 weeks, okay? And once we pass 50 weeks of job-protected leave, you start seeing negative impact on women's employment, indicating that perhaps women, if leave are very, very generous, are finding kind of less easy to get a job. The demand side, the employer might be very, very reluctant to hire women when the leaves is particularly, goes over a year, okay? And this is the protected leave. When it comes to paid leave instead, the kind of the golden point where you still see positive effect in employment is between 14 to 16 weeks of paid leave, which, you know, as we were discussing before, you know, Spain got that right. And however, again, because of the following, so there could be, there's still, even in presence of moderate amount of leave, there might still be negative consequences, not negative consequences on employment, but negative consequences on earnings of women, especially of the highly educated, the more leave you give women, okay? So what happens? So according to the model, we should give more leave to the men, and in this case, and we'll discuss it in a second with Lidia, this is, with fathers do respond to incentives, so we might want to give daddy quotas, okay? But it's an issue of, you know, where should we, when? You know, should they be able to take it contemporaneously or not? That still is an open question, I think. And finally, I want to emphasize that in some context, you know, gender neutral policies in leave might actually lead to worse outcome for women, exactly because of the patterns of specialization of who's doing more of the homework. So one famous study in US academia has been, once they gave exactly the same leave to men and women when they have a child, okay? Men's productivity, the men were home writing papers, and women were home taking care of the children. So the gender neutral leave actually increased the promotion rate of men in academia in the US relative to women. So this is another instance in which a very, very well-meaning policy actually backfired because of the underlying pattern of specialization and norm. For childcare, again, as I said before, more generous childcare spending tend to really, by a government, by a nation, tend to enhance women employment. So basically, once you review of this literature, what really matters is not just the 6 months of, you know, whether you give 6 months of leave, because children, you know, we know that in many countries now, children can go to daycare at age 3. The real issue is what happened between age 6 months for a child and age 2.9 to 3 years. So what is that part is key for policies that are kind of trying to get more women to stay in the labor market, and they're kind of aiming for gender equality. So basically the conclusion of all these analyses that we did across many, many studies is that, you know, parental leave matters to some extent, but what really, really is important is keeping women in the labor force, giving them opportunity through childcare to stay, okay? So to conclude, you know, what are the areas where we still need to kind of do more research, okay? One is thinking about workplace organization, okay? So given policies, why is that being absent for work for 4 months or cutting hours of production when you're back, why does that behavior disproportionately result in earning loss for women, okay? Here really, I think, if we want to think about this, we have to think about, you know, in a synergistic way about organization of work. Do long hour really means that we're more productive? Do we really need, you know, to go out for dinner, and something that women tend not to do, and instead it is found to be really leading to promotion, okay? Is that really matters? So maybe in some occupation it does, to the extent that business is done at dinner, but that really is going, has issues, because women are more likely to have to go back home and cannot do those dinners. So, so to this extent, COVID offered an interesting shock, in the sense that I think many companies are figuring out that you don't need to travel to Japan to sign the contract. You might maybe do most of the meeting online. Those type of technological changes, and they might actually help women in a sense, okay? The other thing, and this is the last thing that I would say, is that the other underexplored area is the political economy of these policies. Okay, so we do know that whether the policy is motivated by, whether extending, the devil is in the details fundamentally. So when maternity leave policies are designed with natalist, pro-natalist views, okay, they tend to be correlated with more negative outcomes for women than when the maternal leave policy is designed in response to women's demand to having ability to combine career and family, okay? So there is not so much work in this area, but because it's hard, it's really hard to think about in a causal way about the emergence of and the shape of certain policy in response to a political process, but that is interesting. And then finally, I think as the number of couples, opposite sex couple decreases, and marriage and having children gets different shapes, right? There are more cohabiting couple with children and so forth. There are more same-sex couple. When we think about these type of policies, I think there's as this new family structure emerge, I think it would be important to really think about the design of these policies in relation to families that it's decreasingly kind of traditional in type. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. So thank you, Claudia. This was super interesting talk. I have a few questions, so I'm gonna try to start some debate. The first one is related to parental leave policies. So you've talked a bit about parental leave policies. And also, so in your talk, you have suggested that social norms may be the factor that we need to eradicate to promote or to achieve convergence or complete convergence. And actually, in terms of thinking about the optimal parental leave policy design, so from my work in Spain and some other international evidence, we know that indeed paternity leave has a very strong positive impact on the take-up of fathers. And actually, it can be a powerful tool to change social norms because fathers get more involved and children see a change in gender roles within the family. So having said that, I would like to know your opinion on the optimal design of parental leave policies.
Thank you for the question. It's really important, and I mean, definitely, I think your work has made a lot of progress on this question. So one thing that I didn't emphasize enough when I was talking about the theory is that to some extent, if we think about gender equality in the labor market, right, the flip side of that is gender equity at home. So if you want to make progress towards more equal opportunities, economic opportunities in the labor market, that progress kind of starts at home. Okay, in this sense, so having a paternity leave and having the fathers actually taking it seems to be kind of the right way to go, because it would suggest that if the fathers are more active contributor in their children's upbringing earlier on, that might really be important for their future involvement in childcare, and that itself then has consequences for gender earnings. Mm-hmm. I think the question is there, the open question is, when should we give leave? Should this leave that we give to fathers be at the same time as that of mothers? How how many weeks exactly. If one of the important arguments on this is that men bond, so one of the important arguments, actually pro-natalist argument for maternity leave was bonding, okay? Women should be home early on because they need to bond with their children and so forth. Bonding works for guys too. I mean, so to the extent that in that sense, potentially having the father taking that leave early on might have, more consequences, better consequences in the long run. But in the opposite that I can see in this case is that if you give fathers, say, leave when the kid is 2, and they haven't been part of the production up to that point, that maybe might not lead to big differences. So the gender-neutral policy evidence actually suggests that maybe they're home, there is a nanny, and they do work. So I think it's a consideration. I mean, it's important. I think paternal leave is important, but I think one has to think carefully about both contemporaneous to mothers or not, and when, Okay.
Thank you. So another point you have raised during your talk is subsidized childcare, right? So I strongly believe that childcare is a very promising policy to foster gender convergence. And actually, it's a policy that has 2 effects, right? It may have a positive effect on female labor supply and also a positive effect on child development, right? But still, here in Spain and in many other countries, childcare is only universal from 3 years old onwards, right? So how can we convince our governments that we really need to subsidize and to have universal childcare below age 3?
So, okay, of course, it's always hard to, give the perfect recommendation. I mean, as I said before, the overwhelming evidence from the literature, the policy evaluation literature, is that for women having childcare between age 6 months of their child and that 3-year, the magical number, 2.9 to 3 years, it's really fundamental. I mean, for them to be able to stay in the labor market and minimize the cost, the career cost in the future. I think in that sense, obviously, therefore, if the government could open, many governments have this type of childcare available now, but it's really, really limited. There are very few spots, they're assigned in a certain way. And so most women, especially women that have kind of low to middle income, might not actually get a spot and might not be able to go to the private sector because it's too costly given their earnings. In addition, so what is the solution? What one could tell you, an opponent of this could tell you, oh, there's a market solution, right? If there is such high demand for childcare between age 6 months and 3 years, perhaps more childcare center will open, okay? So to that, I would respond that childcare, because of the young age, is very highly regulated between age 6 months and 3. So it wouldn't be, it's not that easy. That's why I think there is less entry into that type of market for childcare than in 3 and above, okay? So number one, since given the regulation of the market, that is an area where, government to some extent can really make a difference. In terms of, of course, it would be costly, but then there I would make an efficiency argument. I don't think we can afford as a society to lose all these very highly educated women when they have children. So I don't know, it's a cost and benefit analysis, but I think that's an area that seems, where you can get more money for each buck, for the buck, as they say in America, by kind of maybe investing in that area, yeah.
Thank you. So one more question. In the conclusions, you have mentioned workplace flexibility. I think that this is also very important to achieve gender convergence, but we know little, and there is little causal evidence on the impact that workplace flexibility may have on productivity and also on the distribution of family responsibilities. Moreover, in my opinion, in a context where there are of traditional social norms, workplace flexibility may even reinforce the male breadwinner model if the policy is gender neutral, right? Or if women are women who mostly benefit from these flexible work arrangements. So what's your view on that? More or less, so really, do we really want more workplace flexibility, or how do we regulate workplace flexibility?
So workplace flexibility is the hard part of workplace flexibility is that it's usually associated with the so-called mommy track. You know, once you choose to work part-time, or to be working from home, that is kind of, from the standpoint of the employer, it's like, she's really not very interested in that job, maybe she's not promotion material. So it really, you get somewhat stuck in a line within a firm where it's almost impossible to then achieve the promotion. So to the extent that flexibility means mommy track, it's not necessarily flexibility is good, okay? So I think the issue is, our long hours, I was saying before, really mean more productivity? I don't know, so exactly. So I think we need to think about these issues of work flexibility in a more, in a broader way, and to think about, and perhaps in some profession, we are, the norms of the profession to be considered successful perhaps are not, and we don't know. I mean, do we know if we're more productive when we work a lot more hours? So I think we need to open a real conversation on the structure of work. Mm-hmm. COVID is interesting because it has normalized working from home to some extent. So, both men and women are working from home, and I think in many jobs we see that we have now moved to a situation where, maybe you work at home 3 days a week, 2 days a week you go to the office, and the men are also doing this. Mm-hmm. And that can really help with childcare responsibility, but it would help as long as it remains neutral.
Okay, so very last question, and then we open questions to the audience, is that, okay, so traditionally, we have used arguments based on social justice to defend or to implement public policies to foster gender equality, right? But all these policies are very expensive, right? Subsidized childcare, parental leaves, and so on are very expensive. So I think that we really need to change or to shift the focus or the attention to the efficiency gains of gender equality, right? So would you agree with this?
Definitely, to the extent that there are barriers, whether they are due to, I don't know, lack of childcare or the structure of work or pure discrimination, for example, or to the extent that this barrier affect the allocation of talent, the way in economics, oftentimes the model is like, okay, each of us has a bunch of productivities, okay? And, I can be productive, very productive at being a doctor. I could be also very, very productive at doing clinic, but maybe comparatively, being a doctor would be great. To the extent that I don't become a surgeon, not because I don't have talent, but because I'm a woman, I don't think it's a good idea to enter that profession, for example, because I know there will be huge career costs. I think that's very costly. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to, that's another area where and to some extent that we're thinking about the reallocation of time between home and market and across different types of jobs so that we obtain efficiency might be important, especially again now that more women than men have college degree and things like that.
Okay. Thank you for your answers. And now questions from the public.
Muy bien, muchas gracias.
Well, thank you so very much. Thank you. Thank you so very much. We do have time for some questions from our audience with a microphone. I'm going to ask you, however, to please remember our golden rules about questions. First, the questions need to be specific. The second rule, they need to be short and pithy. And third, they need to be questions. Questions, not comments, please. Not comments. These are extremely interesting issues. We're all very, very interested, but please make them questions.
All right. So I have a question that has to do with, you mentioned social norms as the reason that one can change the things that are going on. I wonder if there's been tried policies in education to change social norms, because I didn't hear anything in the talk about that, and I've read a little bit the literature, I'm not quite aware there's anything in education that has been tried. Just to make a comparison, I know for sure that education has been crucial in, for example, the big change that has been in attitudes towards homosexual marriage in the US and in other countries, but I haven't seen anything on education and this particular thing on gender roles, but I may not know all the literature.
I think, okay, so with the gender, the problem of gender roles is that, so there is a lot of work being done with programs like girls, trying to, in STEM, trying to go past stereotypes such as women, are not good at math, or women cannot program, and so forth. Policy about the family. So these are the policies that have been implemented, I'm telling you, because the idea is, if we get women to have, I think underlying this is that those are jobs that, where you have this type of skills that pay more. And so the one way to gender equality would be to have encouraged women to enter male-dominated field, because that could help us later on, okay? So, it's, so I think there are a few studies. Some of them, one I know is in progress, so by someone who's just started working on it, trying to focus more on, education policy that have to do with, home economics, okay? So, for instance, I think Nuria, right, has a paper on Japan, where she's analyzing the fact that, they used to have home economics classes that were run separately by gender for men and women, for boys and girls, and where the girls were more taught how to cook, and the women and the guys how to fix a light bulb or something like that. And I think that what changed there is that they were totally gender segregated, and they put them together, and they want to. So this is one that I know of, but I think the issue in this context, and this is related to work that we both have done, Lidia, perhaps the gender roles, part of gender roles, in part, the stereotyping happens at home, actually, not so much in school. And so as we both know from our work, the model, the gender, the roles, if you live in families where, mom and dad work and equally share childcare, that might affect your either preferences or productivity in the future, and that can help move things along. But these are processes that I don't think you can exactly legislate. There's no way to legislate, and we shouldn't, absolutely. But, if you get the parents, the fathers more involved, that can help not just today, but also in the future. And I think it's happening to some extent. if fathers are more part of children's life, etc. Yeah. So I think we as mothers have a...
If I may add something very shortly, we do have some work showing that the introduction of the paternity leave permit in Spain in 2007 led to less traditional attitudes among eligible kids. So, I mean, this is only attitudes, so we cannot measure labor market outcomes, but there seems to be something going on.
Okay, Jose.
Yes, I was surprised by one of the first figures that you show on STEM, because it seems like for computer sciences, before the personal computer, there was a huge increase. Is there anything we can learn of what was going on before the personal computer era that can be applied in other setups in other countries?
So I think that is fascinating, and it's kind of, I think in history, right? So the first example was the typewriter, okay? Typewriters weren't created for women. I mean, women weren't doing the office jobs. But all of a sudden, that's like a task where disproportionately, right, you start seeing women. I mean, so that I know of work that has been done trying to actually pin down this mega introduction of the typewriters, and somewhat, something that was first mostly for workplaces where there were very few women, becomes a huge female technology, right? And I think in computers initially, it's a similar argument. Initially, from the typewriter to the first machines and to organizing this, the very, very early computer, I think women actually, it's like being an accountant over time. That there was something that is measurable, that you can be credentialized. It was kind of female. Then it takes off, it becomes successful, and sure enough, women are not there anymore. So I don't know what we can learn in terms of policy, but I think it's really interesting to think about this type of dynamics, actually, that really go counter, yeah.
Hi, I was wondering if there is any type of study about the direct financial aid to families, both as a way of making equality policies and to increase birth rates. And what's your opinion on that?
Okay, so let me start with the cross-country evidence. So across countries, you see that countries that start spending more on childcare actually have higher fertility rates. So it's kind of, this is a correlation, it's not causal, but in part it's mechanical, right? There are more kids, so more spending, but I think you can look at the timing of policy. So I think spending in childcare, it's tend to be related, to fertility. So I'm not sure, but so in terms of studies, there are many studies that have analyzed kind of program directed at like in-work benefit or program directed at, lower income family. And it's not so much about gender equality in a sense, but it's really about, both investing in mothers and their children. So the effect here are not about the fertility per se, but about, it has been found in different contexts that these type of subsidies that are directed plus quality childcare have had positive impact on the existing children. But countries where these things are in place are also countries that have more children to some extent today. So, I think connecting your question to what Lidia was saying before about how do we make an efficiency argument, I think to the extent, so we don't want highly educated women to not marry or enter unions or not to have children. We would like to encourage their fertility. So I don't know if you want to make an argument that, about helping them through this type of policies, but it has been made by some people. But there are not a lot of, I don't know if you know more studies about direct effects on fertility. No.
Todavía podríamos tener tiempo para una pregunta más.
Hi, Claudia, thank you. So you talked about work flexibility and work arrangements, and you mentioned long hours, but I'm wondering if there's any evidence to the returns to correlated work schedules, because sometimes it's not about the length of the day, but about learning from coworkers, coordinating, and that seems to be the challenge of work flexibility, right?
Exactly. And in part is, so again, it goes back to the production function really, and in some places, for some profession, might work better than others, I don't know, so doctors that are not surgeons. So for surgeons, I think it's hard not to have a long day when you are, but it seems that the medical profession in some cases has figured out by, having this group of doctors where you don't need to be, you can kind of, it is divisible, where you share patients, that seems to matter even if you're not there at the same time. So in that kind of context, perhaps the spillovers effect are not, in some cases you can work around it. In other cases, it is difficult, but if you can coordinate people perhaps on being there maybe 2 days a week, and the rest of the time we work in teams, but online, or, I think that part of the intellectual exchange is very important. And especially for new workers, it's really hard to do that online, and you really miss, that can be important for productivity. And coordinated schedule may be different, but perhaps, if you establish that Wednesday is the day where we all show up at the office or something like that, so something that could, and then other days where you can work from. It's a difficult question, right? And in fact, even with COVID, we thought at some point, right, that, maybe we have resolved the problem. In the sense that, now everybody works from home. But to your point, firms are finding that actually it's important to also get people together. So, but I don't think that's about long hours. I think the long hours necessarily. I think the issue with the long hours and the production function is that does it make sense that if I work 30 instead of 45 or 50 hours, I make not just, 10,000 less, I never make it to earning the very big money. So I think, is that proportionate, commensurate? So I think that was more what I was trying to say.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think the time has come to say thank you. A round of applause, please, for our speakers.